Hi, Ms. Moskowitz here. Welcome to English. Today we're going to start reading chapter 3 of Call the Wild. I hope you're enjoying the book so far. I'm going to avoid a lot of interjection or teaching with this chapter because there's so much action that I think it's better to just be part of the movement or flow of the words. So before I start reading, some of the ideas that we should be thinking about are this idea of Buck becoming more and more wild and less civilized. At this moment, like there's going to be a struggle between Buck and Spitz over who's top dog or dominant. So dominant means whoever is in control or power. This idea of the dominant primordial beast. Primordial means something ancient, like before the dinosaurs, something from before time. So you're like oldest instincts. So one of the things to think about is Buck's relationship with Spitz as we read. As far as, I have a lot of country life around me. And one of the things that I've been noticing is now that I'm home during the day, I looked out the window right before I started reading this, and there was a turkey vulture, like a young one though, not like super big. And it scooped down, picked up a chipmunk, flew through the air and landed in one of the trees and proceeded to like devour the chipmunk in the tree. This is what it means to be like in the wild. And all of our house pets have some sense of wild in them. So I'm going to start reading, and I hope you enjoy this part of the story. The dominant primordial beast was strong in Buck, and under the fierce conditions of trail life, it grew and grew. Yet it was a secret growth. His newborn cunning gave him poise and control. He was too busy adjusting himself to the new life to feel at ease or comfortable, and not only did he not pick fights, but he avoided them whenever possible. A certain deliberateness characterized his attitude. He was not prone to rashness and precipitate action, meaning he thought before he acted. And in the bitter hatred between him and Spitz, he betrayed no impatience, shunned all offensive acts. So every time Spitz is aggressive to him, he just kind of pretends that he doesn't notice and doesn't kind of fall for that trap. On the other hand, possibly because he divined in Buck, the Spitz, a dangerous rival, Spitz never lost an opportunity of showing his teeth. He even went out of his way to bully Buck, striving constantly to start the fight, which could only end in the death of one or the other. Early in the trip, this might have taken had it not been for an unwanted accident. At the end of this day, they made a bleak and miserable camp on the shore of Lake Labarge. Driving snow, a wind that cut like a white-hot knife, and darkness had forced them to grope for a camping place. Notice the simile there. They could hardly have fared worse. At their backs rose a perpendicular, meaning like at a 90-degree angle, wall of rock, so straight up, and Perrault and Francois were compelled or felt forced to make their fire and spread their sleeping robes on the ice of the lake itself. The tent they had discarded at Daae in order to travel light, and a few sticks of driftwood furnished them with a fire that thawed down through the ice and left them to eat supper in the dark. So imagine how dangerous and scary that they're burning this fire on the ice. It's really crazy. As I just said that, like my fireplace just started and like totally kicked on. So fire, really nice when it's cold, but now imagine a fire like that going out like all over the ice and having to sleep on that. Close in, under the sheltering rock, Buck made his nest. So snug and warm was it that he was loath or didn't want to leave it when Francois distributed the fish which he had first thawed over the fire. But when Buck finished his ration and returned, he found his nest occupied. A warning snarl told him that the trespasser was Spitz. Till now, Buck had avoided trouble with his enemy, but this was too much. The beast in him roared. He sprang upon Spitz in a fury which surprised them both, and Spitz, particularly, for his whole experience with Buck had gone to teach him that his rival was an unusually timid dog, who managed to hold his own only because of his great weight and size. So at this moment, Spitz is caught off guard because up till this moment, every time Spitz has gone after Buck, he's kind of rebuffed or ignored his attentions. Suddenly, Buck snaps, and this catches Spitz off guard, which gives Buck a little bit of an edge here. Francois was also surprised, and when they shot out in a tangle from the disrupted nest, and he divined the cause of the trouble. "Ah!" he cried to Buck. "Give it to him, by gar! Give it to him, the dirty thief!" So Francois totally on Buck's side. Spitz was equally willing. He was crying with sheer rage and eagerness as he circled back and forth for the chance to spring in. Buck was no less eager and no less cautious as he likewise circled back and forth for the advantage. But it was then that the unexpected happened. The thing which projected their struggle for supremacy far into the future past many a weary mile of trail and toil. This is a little bit of foreshadowing here, telling you that something is about to happen. Excuse me. An oath from Perrault, the resounding impact of a club upon a bony frame, and a shrill yelp of pain heralded the breaking forth of pandemonium. The camp was suddenly discovered to be alive with skulking furry forms, starving huskies, 4 or 5 score of them, who had scented the camp from some Indian village. They had crept in while Buck and Spitz were fighting, and when the 2 men sprang among them with stout clubs, they showed their teeth and fought back. They were crazed by the smell of the food. Perrault found one with a head buried in the grub box. His club landed heavily on the gaunt or skinny ribs, and the grub box was capsized on the ground. On the instant, a score of the famished brutes were scrambling for the bread and the bacon. The clubs fell upon them unheeded, and they yelped and howled under the rain of blows, but struggled none the less madly till the last crumb had been devoured. In the meantime, so here you have Buck and Spitz, and they're about to have their end-all be-all fight. But just as they're about to really get at it, and one of them is going to go down forever, good, dead, suddenly all these random crazy stray sled dogs come. Like, they're probably abandoned, they're starving, maybe their sled team fell apart in the wilderness. These are like wild dogs who are starving in the wilderness. They smell this bacon and they're like, "I'm going in, I'm starving to death, I'm going to die anyways." And so this creates a crazy pandemonium, which means chaos and outburst. So let's go back to the reading. In the meantime, the astonished team dogs had burst out of their nest only to be set upon by the fierce invaders. Never had Buck seen such dogs. It seemed as though their bones would burst through their skins. They were mere skeletons draped loosely in their draggled hides with blazing eyes and slavered fangs. But the hunger madness made them terrifying and irresistible. There was no opposing them. The team dogs were swept back against the cliff at the first onset. Buck was beset by 3 huskies, and at a trace his head and shoulders were ripped and slashed. The din was frightful. Billy was crying as usual. Dave and Sol-leks, dripping blood from the score of wounds, were bravely fighting side by side, and Joe was snapping like a demon. Once his teeth closed on a foreleg of a husky, and he crunched down through the bone. Pike, the malingerer, leapt upon a crippled animal, breaking his neck in a quick flash of teeth and jerk, and Buck got a frothy adversary by the throat and was sprayed with blood when his teeth sank through the jugular or main vein in the throat. The warm taste of it in his mouth goaded him to a greater fierceness, and he flung himself upon another, and at the same time felt teeth sink into his own throat. It was Spitz treacherously attacking from the side. So, okay, we got to stop here for a second. So here you have a whole crazy sled dog fight. All the wild starving huskies, and then these fitter, healthier sled dogs who are all on one team. And Billy and Dave and Sol-leks and Bucks and everybody else is working together against the wild sled dogs. And Buck, out of nowhere, is attacked by Spitz, who, what a betrayal, right? Because, like, even if you're having, like, a fight with your teammate, outsiders come in, who do you take, sides with? This is a horrible betrayal. That's what treacherous means. All right, let's scroll up. Perrault and Francois, having cleaned out their part of the camp, hurried to save their sled dogs. So they cleaned out their part of the camp by beating these poor starving dogs with clubs. The wild wave of famished beasts rolled back before them, and Buck shook himself free. But it was only for a moment, and the two men were compelled to run back to save the grub, upon which the huskies returned to the attack on the team. Grub is another word for food. Billy, terrified into bravery, sprang through the savage circle and fled away over the ice. Pike and Dub followed on his heels with the rest of the team behind, and as Buck drew himself together to spring after them, out of the tail of his eye he saw Spitz rush upon him with the evident intention of overthrowing him. Once upon his feet and under the mass of huskies, there was no hope for him, but he braced himself to the shock of Spitz's charge, then joined the flight, or running away, out on the lake. This is another thing we got to remember. They were up against a cliff like this, so they're blocked. There's no escape, and the whole rest of the landscape is just sheer ice. Later, the 9 team dogs gathered together and sought shelter in the forest. Though unpursued, they were a sorry plight. There was not one of them not wounded in 4 or 5 places, while some were wounded grievously, or like almost to the point of death. Dub was badly injured in a hind leg. Dolly, the last husky added to the team at Dyea, had a badly torn throat, and Joe had lost an eye, while Billy, the good-natured, with an ear chewed to rent and ribbons, cried and whimpered throughout the night. And at daybreak, they limped warily back to the camp to find the marauders gone and the 2 men in bad tempers. Fully half their grub supply was gone. The huskies had chewed through the sled lashings and the canvas coverings. In fact, nothing, no matter how remotely edible, had escaped them. They had eaten a pair of Perrault's moose-hide moccasins, chunks out of the leather traces, and even 2 feet of lash from the end of Francois's whip. He broke out from a mournful contemplation of it to look over at his wounded dogs. "Oh, my friends," he said softly, "maybe it make you mad, dog. Dose many bites. Maybe bad dog. Sacre them. What you think, Perrault?" The courier shook his head dubiously. With 400 miles of trail between him and Dawson, he could ill afford to have madness break out among his dogs. 2 hours of cursing and exertion got the harness into shape, and the wound-stiffened team was underway, struggling painfully over the hardest part of the trail they had yet to encounter, and for that matter, the hardest between them and Dawson. The river's not frozen solid, so they aren't going to be able to cross it. At this point, everything's a wreck. They have almost no food left. The starving huskies ate through the ropes, and when they talk about madness breaking out amongst the dogs, what they're talking about is rabies. Because if the dogs were actually infected with this, then the entire sled team could be infected. But at this point, they have no other option but to just hook these poor, sick, struggling dogs back on and try to get out of there. Because the closer they get to civilization, the more able they will to have access to food. All right, so the courier, that's like a mailman, shook his head dubiously, or with doubt. With 400 miles of trail still between him and Dawson, he could ill afford to have madness break out among his dogs. 2 hours of cursing and exertion. Sorry, I just read that part to you, so I'm going to scroll back down to here. There we go. The 30-mile river was wide open. Its wild water defied the frost and was in the eddies only in the quiet places that the ice held it all. 6 days of exhausting toil were required to cover those 30 terrible miles. And terrible they were, for every foot of them was accomplished at the risk of life to dog and man. A dozen times Perrault, nosing the way, broke through the ice bridges, being saved by the long pole that he carried, which he so held it that it fell each time across the hole made by his body. So he's using this long pole so that he has something to grab himself and pull himself back through the ice. God forbid he falls through, because there's weak spots. So he's testing ahead of the way of the sled dogs. But a cold snap was on, and the thermometer registering 50 below zero, and each time he broke through, he was compelled for very life to build a fire and dry his garments. So he is falling into water, and it is negative 50 below 0 degrees outside. It is amazing that he's able to survive this type of experience at all. Nothing daunted him. It was because nothing daunted him or stopped him that he had been chosen for government courier mailman. It took all manner of risks, resolutely thrusting his little weazened or shriveled face into the frost and struggling on from dim dawn to dark. He skirted the frowning shores of rim ice that bent and crackled underfoot upon which they dared not halt. And once the sled broke through with Dave and Buck, and they were half frozen and all but drowned by the time they were dragged out, meaning the sled broke through and fell into the ice and they had to pull the dogs out. The usual fire was necessary to save them, and they were coated solidly with ice, and the two men kept them on the run around the fire, sweating and thawing, so close that they were singed by the flames. At another time, Spitz went through, dragging the whole team after him up to Buck, who strained backward with all his strength, his four paws on the slippery edge and the ice quivering and snapping all around. But behind him was Dave, likewise straining backward, and behind the sled was Francois, pulling till his tendons cracked. Again, the rim ice broke away before and behind, and there was no escape except up the cliff. Perrault scaled it by a miracle, while Francois prayed for just that miracle, and with every thong and sled lashing and the last bit of harness rove into a long rope, the dogs were hoisted one by one to the cliff rest, so up and over the cliff. Francois came up at last, and after the sled and load, and then came the search for the place to descend, which descent was ultimately made by the aid of a rope, and night found them back on the river with a quarter of a mile to the day's credit. All of that work to go a quarter of a mile. They had to scale the side of the cliff, drag and pull the dogs up, bring them back down the other side. By the time they made the Hootalinqua and Good Ice, I suppose that's a waterway, Buck was played out. The rest of the dogs were in like condition, but Perrault, to make up time, pushed them late and early. The first day they covered 35 miles to the Big Salmon, and now remember they have 400 to go. The next day, 35 more to Little Salmon. The third day, 40 miles, which brought them well up towards the Five Fingers. Buck's feet were not so compact and hard as the feet of the Huskies. His had softened during the many generations since the day his last wild ancestor was tamed by a cave dweller or riverman. All day long he limped in agony, and camp was made. Once it was made, laid down like a dead dog. Hungry as he was, he would not move to receive his ration of fish, which Francois had to bring to him. Also, the dog driver rubbed Buck's feet for half an hour each night after supper and sacrificed the tops of his own moccasins to make 4 moccasins for Buck. This was a great relief, and Buck caused even the weazened face of Perrault to twist itself into a grin one morning when Francois forgot the moccasins and Buck lay on his back, his 4 feet waving appealingly in the air, and refused to budge without them. Later, his feet grew hard to the trail, and the worn-out footgear was thrown away. So some of the things to think about here is that Buck is trying to build up his feet, like, calluses you get from using them again and again. So until then, he has to have these like little booties, and he doesn't travel anywhere without them. Okay. At the Pelly one morning, they were harnessing up Dolly, who had never been conspicuous for anything, went suddenly mad. She announced her condition, and again, this means rabies, which you can get by touching the spit of a wild animal. Dolly, who had never been conspicuous or noticeable about anything, went suddenly mad. She announced her condition by a long, heartbreaking wolf howl that sent every dog bristling with fear that sprang straight for Buck. He had never seen a dog go mad, nor did he have any reason to fear madness, yet he knew that here was a horror, and fled away from it in a panic, and straightway he raced with Dolly panting and frothing, one leap behind, nor could she gain on him, so great was his terror, nor could he leave her, so great was her madness. He plunged through the wooded breast of the island, flew down the lower end, crossed a back channel filled with rough ice to another island, gained a third island, curved back to the main river, and in desperation started to cross it. And all the time, though he did not look, he could hear her snarling, one leap behind. Francois called to him a quarter of a mile away, and he doubled back, still one leap ahead, gasping painfully for air and putting all his faith in it that Francois would save him. The dog driver had the axe poised in the air, and as Buck shot past him, the axe crashed down upon Mad Dolly's head. Buck staggered over to the shed, exhausted, sobbing for breath, and helpless. This was Spitz's opportunity. He sprang upon Buck, and twice his teeth sank into his unresisting foe and ripped and tore the flesh to the bone. Then Francois's lash descended, and Buck had the satisfaction of watching Spitz receive the worst whipping as yet administered to any of the teams. "When devil that Spitz," remarked Perrault. "Someday them killed that Buck." "That Buck two devils," was Francois's rejoinder or response. "All day, Tim, I watched that Buck. I know for sure. Listen, someday, one fine day, he'll get mad like hell, and one day chew that Spitz up and spit him out from the snow for sure, I know." So basically, they're like, look, one day one of them is going to take the other down. Perrault's like, one day Spitz is going to kill Buck, and Francois is like, no, one day Buck is going to kill Spitz, definitely. And so at this moment, I have to stop for a second and tell you that they were forced to kill Dolly because Dolly had rabies. And so after chasing Buck through all of these islands and coming back around, Buck sees that he has the axe in the air, and he's like, all right, and he has all his faith in man. So he runs by, and as they run by, the axe comes down, on poor Dolly's head. All right, so to continue the story. From then on, it was war between them. Spitz, as lead dog and acknowledged master of the team, felt his supremacy threatened by this strange Southland dog. And strange Buck was to him, for of the many Southland dogs he had known, not one had shown up worthily in camp and on trail. They were all too soft, dying under the toil of the frost and the starvation. Buck was the exception. He alone endured and prospered, matching the husky in strength, savagery, and cunning. Then he was a masterful dog, and what made him dangerous was the fact that the club of the man in the red sweater had knocked all blind pluck and rashness out of his desire for mastery. Buck was preeminently cunning and could bide his time with patience, and there was nothing less than primitive. So he has, unlike the other dogs, he has a mixture between the civilized and the savage at this point that allows him to kind of plan and plot and take his time and step back, whereas Spitz just like pure savage power. Buck is cunning and ruthless, and he's going to wait it out and take his time. It was inevitable that the clash for leadership should come. Buck wanted it. He wanted it because it was his nature, because he had been gripped tight by that nameless, incomprehensible pride of the trail and trace, and that pride which holds dogs to the toil to the last gasp, which lures them to die joyfully in the harness and breaks their heart if they are cut out of the harness. This was the pride of Dave as wheel dog, and so Lex as he pulled up with his strength, the pride that laid hold of them to break at camp, transforming them from sour and sullen brutes into straining, eager, ambitious creatures, the pride that spurred them on all day and dropped them at the pitch of camp at night, letting them fall back into gloomy unrest and uncontent. This was the pride that bore up Spitz and made him thrash the sled dogs who blundered and shirked in the traces or hid away at harness up time in the morning. Likewise, it was this pride that made him fear Buck as possible lead dog, and this was Buck's pride too. He only threatened the other's leadership. He came between him and the shirks he should have punished, and he did it deliberately. One night there was a heavy snowfall, and in the morning Pike, the malingerer, did not appear. He was securely hidden in his nest under a foot of snow. Francois called them and sought them in vain. Spitz was wild with wrath. He raged through the camp, smelling and digging in every likely place, snarling so frightfully that Pike heard and shivered in his hiding place. So Pike is hiding because he doesn't want to get going for the day. And as the sled dog, Spitz is going around and getting very angry that he's not obeying and coming running. But when he was at last unearthed and Spitz flew at him to punish him, because this is his job as lead dog, Buck flew with equal rage in between. So unexpected was it, and so shrewdly managed, that Spitz was hurled backward and off his feet. Pike, who had been trembling abjectly, took heart at this open mutiny, that means like overthrowing power, and sprang upon his overthrown leader. Buck, to whom fair play was a forgotten code, likewise sprang upon Spitz. But Francois, chuckling at the incident while unserving in the administration of justice, brought his lash down upon Buck with all his might. This failed to drive Buck from his prostrate rival, but the butt of the whip was brought into play. Half stunned by the blow, Buck was knocked backward, and the lash laid upon him again and again, while Spitz soundly punished the many times offending Pike. In the days that followed, the Dawson grew closer and closer. Buck still continued to interfere with Spitz and the culprits, but he did it craftily. When Francois was not around with the covert mutiny of Buck, a general insubordination sprang up and increased. So it's at this point, Buck has enlisted all the other dogs to his side. They can't stand Spitz. They're like, all right, we're going to side with Buck. Look, he's sticking up for us. He's helping us out. Dave and Sol-Leks were unaffected, but the rest of the team went from bad to worse. Things were no longer right. There was general bickering and jangling. Trouble was always afoot, and at the bottom of it was Buck. He kept Francois busy, for the dog driver was in a constant apprehension of the life and death struggle between the two, which he knew would take place sooner or later. And on more than one night, the sound of quarreling and strife among the other dogs turned him out of his sleeping robe, fearful that Buck and Spitz were at it. But the opportunity did not present itself, and they pulled into Dawson one dreary afternoon with a great fight still to come. Here were many men and countless dogs, and Buck found them all at work. It seemed the ordained order of things that dogs should work. All day they swung up and down the main street in long teams, and in the night their jingling bells still went by. They hauled cabin logs and firewood freighted up to the mines, and did all manner of work that horses did in the Santa Clara Valley. Here and there Buck met Southland dogs, but in the main they were the wild and husky breed, and every night, regularly at 9, at 12, at 3, they lifted a nocturnal song, a weird and eerie chant, in which was Buck's delight to join. With the aurora borealis flaming coldly overhead, or the stars leaping in the frost dance, and the land numb and frozen under the pall of snow, this song of the huskies might have been the defiance of life, only it was pitched in minor key. With long-drawn wailings and half-sobs, and with more the pleading of life, the articulate travail of existence, it was an old song, old as the breed itself, one of the first songs of the younger world in a day when the songs were sad. It was invested with the woe of unnumbered generations. This plaint by which Buck was so strangely stirred when he moaned and sobbed, it was with the pain of the living, that was the old pain of his wild fathers, and the fear and the mystery of the cold and the dark, that was to them fear and mystery. And that he should be stirred by it marked the completeness by which he harked back through the age of fire and the roof and the raw beginnings of life to the howling ages. The end. The aurora borealis are all these beautiful lights that you could see in the northern sky. So I just couldn't read this. I hope you enjoyed the story. In our next lesson, we will finish reading this chapter. We broke it down kind of like in between two major action shots. So I hope to see you soon for the rest of chapter 3. And thanks for joining. Remember that you always check into video chat during my office hours if you want to talk, or text me, message me, whatever, if you have any questions. All right, love you guys and miss you all. See you soon. Bye.